Yes, I am painting an orc purple, but not all of it. I'm leaving some of it grey so I can still see it. Annoyingly, I do have to quickly explain why I'm painting an orc purple before I can get to what this video is actually about. I recently painted a little goblin using a technique inspired by 52 Miniatures, where I painted the skin in a bruised red and glazed on a light green, and I really liked that effect and wanted to experiment with a slight variation. This time, instead of glazing, I will be two-paint mixing, which is a technique that I use a lot. Essentially, on any given part of the model, I choose two pots of paint. One will be my shadow colour, and one will be my highlight colour, and all of the mid-tone and everything in between will be the two paints mixed together. For this orc, the darker skin colour obviously is going to be that purple, but I'm using a dark green as my highlight colour because I want a dark overall look. And this will cause a slight issue later on, but not because it's a dark green specifically. This is actually another technique known as highlighting around the colour wheel. Rather than making the skin brighter as I go from shadow to highlight, I'm bringing it from purple to green. Whilst two paint mixing, my first layer is usually a single coat of only the shadow paint. And then I paint progressive layers in a mix, starting with adding just a small amount of the highlight paint into the shadow paint. And each layer gets more and more of the highlight colour until right at the end I'm pretty much just using the highlight paint without mixing any of the shadow paint into it. Additionally, as I go through these layers, I shrink the surface that I'm painting with each layer, and this can vary depending on what kind of model I'm doing, but at the beginning I'm coating almost all of it, leaving just the tiniest shadow lines and thin recesses with the original shadow paint unmixed, and the last few layers right at the end, in contrast, are going to be the thinnest of the high points and smallest spots at the top with the highlight paint. Right, now that I've explained that, I'll play off the rest of the painting in the background and explain why I'm painting this specific model. So hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and each year I set myself a challenge based on my pile of opportunity. The many unpainted models that I've bought and not quite gotten around to painting just yet. This year is literally just to paint the oldest stuff in my collection, or at least older stuff from my collection. And this orc model isn't really all that terribly old, but it is one that I have had for several years since the parts were kindly gifted to me by my good friend Ratman. They are from Spellcrow, and it's essentially a bag of Mistcast pieces that Spellcrow kind of throw in for free with some orders occasionally, and so there's quite a few imperfections on this particular piece. But I was pretty happy with that, and I used some Milliput here and there. It's not overly perfect, but I didn't really care to fix absolutely everything, and even if I wanted to, I'm not the best of sculptors in the world. But this pirate orc is a pirate, of course, and I'd just like to paint this fun-loving orc in a fun, bright paint scheme. There's a lot of pretty simplistic history, especially low-budget TV, that tells us that history is all brown and dreary, which is almost certainly completely untrue of any era, and the Age of Sail was no different. And yet I still managed to paint his trousers brown, but I quickly highlighted up to them being a white with just that hint of brown in the shadow. I freehanded on some simple stripes just for a bit of fun, a painted bright blue and highlighted in a blue-grey, and I tried to match the highlights of the blue-grey into the highlights of the white areas, and it didn't really work. It's not perfect, but I had a go at least. Moving up to the orc's waistcoat, I painted with a slight variation of my two paint mixing. The only difference essentially is that my first layer, instead of being only my shadow paint, was actually a 50-50 mix of my shadow and highlight paints. And then I highlighted from that 50-50 all the way up to the highlight paint like I usually would. Specifically in this case, it's a dark brown with a very bright, vibrant red being used. And the change I made here to my technique really allows this waistcoat to be very prominent and very bright, as even the shadows are 50% of that bright red paint. and the highlights are just that red paint unmixed. I mention this specifically to point out that, yes, of course, two-paint mixing is a fairly simple technique, but it is incredibly versatile, and it is an expression of what I consider to be a fundamental skill in mini painting. I made sure to get a good camera angle on this because I thought it would look cool, but it didn't. The base is made of wooden stirrers primed in grey, which is very porous, so soaking over that with a brown ink should look really cool. And, well, the effect did look kind of like wood in scale, which is quite nice. The actual process didn't look as cool as I was hoping. Oh, and there's a little starfish, cool little starfish on the base. I sculpted that myself with the leftover milliput that I had from fixing the miscasts. I was getting close to being done, but the model just didn't quite look right. And it was all in my original work on the skin. The skin just wasn't quite how I wanted it to be. And I had a look and I realised what the problem was. The shadow purple I think does look pretty good, but the highlight wasn't highlighty enough. I wanted a dark green skin tone, and that is kind of where I am. But my dark green has a quite strong blue pigment, and obviously the purple underneath has a blue element as well. And so what I realised I needed to do is I didn't need to make the skin any brighter, but rather I needed to make it greener. So I mixed some yellow into my dark green to balance out the blue, and my now new highlight is going to be a much greener green. And I added a few layers of this with only a little bit of yellow mixed in, and then a little more yellow mixed in, but I never went to a pure yellow. And this essentially makes the skin a 3-paint mix. And I told you that 2-paint mixing was versatile, you can even use a 3rd paint. And at this point I was pretty happy with how the model was looking overall. I have a model from deep in my pile of grey now painted up, ready for the gaming table, or more likely the shelf for a little while, as I don't play any piratey games that much. I should play more piratey games. Right then, you lot at home, tell me a model from deep in your pile of grey that you'll paint soon. And when I publish the next video in this series, you can comment there to tell me that you painted it. You will paint it, right? Well, this is my first older model painted for my challenge this year, and I can clear off to something else for a few weeks before I get to the next one. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.